The Soviet Union emerged from World War II as a global superpower, but the victory came at a heavy cost. Tens of millions had died, cities lay in ruins, and the Soviet people faced years of hardship. Under Stalin's iron rule, the USSR rebuilt itself, quickly consolidating its influence over Eastern Europe and positioning itself as a rival to the United States in the Cold War. The Soviet system was built on state control of the economy, strict censorship, and a pervasive secret police force. While the West flourished under capitalism, the Soviet people struggled under a regime that prized military strength and ideological purity over individual freedoms and prosperity. Beneath the surface, resentment and dissatisfaction simmered. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died, and with his death came the possibility of change. Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin, sought to reform the Soviet system, denouncing the brutal purges and repressive policies of his predecessor. His de-Stalinization efforts marked the first signs of a thaw, both politically and culturally. For a brief moment, there was hope. Khrushchev's reforms allowed for a slight easing of tensions with the West and a cultural opening within the Soviet Union. But the promise of reform was short-lived. The Soviet system, with its vast bureaucracy and entrenched power structures, resisted change. By the early 1960s, tensions flared again, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a near-disastrous confrontation between the superpowers. Khrushchev's eventual ouster in 1960 paved the way for Leonid Brezhnev, whose leadership would define the Soviet Union for the next 2 decades. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union became a military giant, but it was also a nation stuck in economic and political stagnation. The Soviet economy, though massive, was inefficient. Central planning had led to widespread corruption and mismanagement. While the West experienced rapid technological advances and economic growth, the Soviet Union fell behind. The cracks were growing deeper, but the leadership was unwilling or unable to change course. The people grew disillusioned, tired of the endless shortages and the lack of freedom. When reform movements emerged in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union responded with brute force. The invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 showed that the USSR was willing to use military might to maintain control. But the seeds of discontent had already been planted within the satellite states and within the Soviet Union itself. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, it was clear that something had to change. The Soviet Union was falling apart from within. Economic stagnation, political corruption, and a costly arms race with the United States were draining the country. Gorbachev believed that the only way to save the Soviet Union was through radical reform. Perestroika aimed to restructure the Soviet economy by introducing limited market reforms, decentralizing control, and allowing for greater autonomy in industry and agriculture. Meanwhile, Glasnost opened up Soviet society, encouraging public discussion, reducing censorship, and allowing for greater political transparency. It was an attempt to modernize the Soviet system without abandoning socialism. For the first time in decades, the Soviet people were allowed to speak openly about their frustrations. The media became more independent and political debates flourished. As Gorbachev's reforms opened the door for greater political freedom, long-suppressed nationalist movements erupted across the Soviet republics. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Baltic states, which had been annexed by the USSR during World War II. By 1990, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were leading the charge for independence, demanding their right to self-determination. Gorbachev faced an impossible choice: crush these independence movements with force and risk civil war, or allow them to secede and risk the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In the end, he chose a path of restraint, hoping to negotiate a new, looser federation. But it was too late. The spirit of nationalism was spreading like wildfire. In August 1991, the Soviet Union faced its most dramatic moment of crisis. A group of hardline communist officials, alarmed by the growing calls for independence and Gorbachev's reforms, staged a coup. They believed that by removing Gorbachev and reasserting control, they could save the Soviet Union. But the coup would prove to be the final nail in the coffin. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Soviet Union. It was a quiet and somber end to a superpower that had once dominated world affairs. The Soviet Union was officially dissolved, and 15 independent republics emerged in its place. The Cold War had ended, and the world had entered a new era.